This is the Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to this podcast at Apple, Google, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, or go to reason.com/podcasts and sign up there. You know, to say we live in a hyper-polarized society is kind of state the obvious, right? Everywhere around us, but especially online, in politics, and in the media, we seem to be, with apologies to Matthew Arnold, trapped on a darkling plain where ignorant armies clash by night. It's impossible to avoid a continuous stream of stories, often gushing from prestigious institutions such as the New York Times and Ivy League universities, of people being canceled for real and imagined thought crimes, political hacks defending objectively awful policy and personal failures, and charges of racism, sexism, and homophobia being launched like drone strikes on unsuspecting civilians. Many in the media and the academy are questioning bedrock commitments to free expression and intellectual freedom that were taken for granted a generation ago. As the former head of the ACLU, Ira Glasser, told me recently, many activists, academics, and journalists believe that free speech is an antagonist to social justice. One journalist who pushes back against all this is Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic who maintains one of the smartest and most engaging Twitter feeds around and publishes the newsletter The Best of Journalism, which highlights exceptional nonfiction journalism. The 41-year-old Southern California native writes about criminal justice reform, the excesses of wokeness and political correctness on the right and the left, and the failure of government to effectively deliver many of the basic services it's supposed to provide. The biggest thing I'm interested in is, can we have a robust public discourse? Can we adjudicate truth propositions together? Friedersdorf tells me in today's podcast. He cites Jonathan Rauch's influential 1993 book, Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, which lays out the case for free and open dialogue in society, especially about contentious topics and ideas. It is a messy process of talking back and forth, and it's really important, says Friedersdorf. We can get tremendous value from it in the future if only we allow it to happen. And I see more and more people not allowing it to happen with the advent of social media. Here is the Reason interview with Conor Friedersdorf. Conor Friedersdorf, thanks for talking to Reason.
I'm glad to be here.
So let's talk about your Twitter feed first, because that's what of yours. I've been enjoying it immensely. It's a lively, rich, and frequently refreshed Twitter feed. You have spent the past couple of days talking about wokeness and PC as having, a right-wing version and a left-wing version, neither of them very good. Can you talk about what are we talking about when you talk about wokeness and PC?
Yeah, so, the words are similar in that they are pejorative. They have a pejorative connotation. And when you kind of look more closely, you see that the thing being described, actually, if you were to apply analytically consistent categories, you'd see that actually some things that you would call woke or PC actually turn out to be good if you were consistent and didn't just use it as a pejorative. So most people agree that we shouldn't going around hurling racial epithets at people. And you could call that political correctness, but no one does because they agree with it. They only call things that they don't agree with political correctness. I think that wokeness is similar. The other aspect I think that there is to wokeness is that the original term, or at least some version of the term. I don't want to say when it was like originally used on Black Twitter or something. I didn't follow it that closely, but the term woke used earnestly seems to imply a kind of sanctimony, like, oh, we're the awake ones and you people who are all asleep don't get it. We do get it. And I think that the way that the term is used pejoratively, it kind of takes that and there's a mocking edge to it. Like you say that you are awake, but actually you're saying things that are nonsense. And so, political correctness, it's easier to see how there are right-wing and left-wing versions of it. Mm-hmm. Some people want to call the right-wing version patriotic correctness. But certainly if you look at something like the Colin Kaepernick controversy, where someone is engaged in political speech at their job and Donald Trump and Mike Pence come in and want to quote unquote cancel them, right? You could see that as basically very similar to what people on the right are complaining about when they call someone woke for wanting to cancel them for political speech at their job. And for me, I'm interested in lots of different things when I think about these questions, but I think the biggest thing I'm interested in is, can we have a robust public discourse? Can we adjudicate truth propositions together? And it goes to this thing that I think John Rausch wrote best about in his book, Kindly Inquisitors, the idea that there's this thing called liberal science, and it helps us to get at the truth. And it is a messy process of talking back and forth. And it's really important. We have gotten tremendous value from it in the past. We can get tremendous value from it in the future, if only we allow it to happen. And I see more and more people not allowing it to happen
Right.
with the advent of social media.
And that's, I mean, that what Rausch is talking about when he's talking about liberal science is, it's kind of the Enlightenment, or it's the process by which the best elements of the Enlightenment come to be, where you have a marketplace of ideas, or maybe in a later iteration by somebody like Jürgen Habermas, it's a public sphere of debate and discussion where you can come and talk about what you believe to be true and try it out. And then people around you say, no, you're full of beans, or you're this, or you're that. And then, the problem, I guess, with PC, political correctness of any stripe, or wokeness, is that people are now saying, no, that system itself is so loaded, and from a left-wing perspective is so racist, is so repressive to somebody, to a exploited person's experience, that we can't allow that. Where does that particular, gesture come from to say that, no, just what you said, like we can, there is a thing called liberal science. We can get to a better approximation of the truth and to a better society by letting people hash out arguments, that's wrong. Where in your estimation does that come from?
Well, I think you see different threads of it. Sometimes it is something like a longstanding taboo against the N-word, for example, and it starts out as a slur, as a taboo against the slur, and then it comes to encompass mere uses through, I think, just concept creep. Through, this thing was taboo, and it crept over time. And so you see something like the recent New York Times controversy, where, a journalist was on a trip with some high school students that he was chaperoning. And it's kind of a ridiculous backstory.
Yeah. And not just some high school students, like exquisitely rich and privileged kids from Andover.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't particularly care for Robert McNeil or his reporting. Or I don't, when I say I don't care for it, I don't really care about it. It's just, It's kind of amazing that in 2019, this guy's been at the Times since 1976, went on this junket and didn't get along with the kids, and then used the N-word. And I mean, I want to hear you talk about this because you've written and commented on this in various formats, but he used the N-word in a discussion where one of the kids was talking about one of their friends who had used it. Yeah. And then they were like, holy cow, I can't believe you said that.
Yeah. So he was asking, what's the context in which you're upset when the person said it? And he said the word. And, he was truth seeking. He was trying to figure out what the truth was about the thing that they were talking about. And Eugene Volokh and Randall Kennedy have written actually a really good paper of, should you use the full N-word in class if you're teaching law students, for example? And so you have this taboo that's crept a bit. I think it's crept for a few reasons, but one of them is that people are just more invested in the kind of care harm moral dimension that they used to be. And what it means to harm someone seems to have crept in ways that I don't entirely understand. So on this trip to Peru, when this reporter says the N-word to ask about if that was what was said, we have 150 journalists signing a petition years later at the Times, and they feel harmed because, it's a little bit unclear because we haven't talked to any of them as individuals, actually, but some seem to have a notion that this transgresses against what's needed to create a racially fair workplace. And others seem to be claiming harm in more of a, I was emotionally triggered sense. And we see both of these uses all over the place. And look, it's not as if it's always unreasonable to say, something or other is creating a racially hostile workplace. We can all dream up scenarios where that would be true. But I think that 5 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, no one would have thought something someone said to white teenagers on a trip to Peru 2 years ago is something that would create a hostile workplace now. That's pretty far from the definition anyone imagined, right? So I don't know why. I've written before, I think back in 2014, about concept creep and harm and how all sorts of harms seem to have crept. And occasionally it's a good thing. It's a good thing that people don't, throw their kids in the car and drive around without seatbelts like they did in some bygone era of American life, but probably a bad thing that they don't let them
in the
run
lifetime of one of us, that was certainly the case.
And yet it's probably a bad thing, that they don't let their kids walk to the park, because even though it doesn't seem to be statistically more dangerous, people's notions of harm have kind of crept. And so just to say that it isn't always necessarily ideological in a way that directly relates to political correctness or wokeness when these things creep.
Yeah, and that is, of course, something in Kindly Inquisitors, Rausch's book, which is over 20 years old. He talks a lot about how words are not bullets. Well, words do not cause harm in the same way as physical force or physical violence. But it seems that since the first publication of that book, and actually even since an updated version that the Cato Institute put out several years ago, that distance has crept, it's vanished essentially, where words now are sticks and stones are, words are sticks and stones, and they hurt you every bit as much as a punch to the face. Yeah. And, the cheap answer to that is that we are a kind of decadent, weak society, right? This is kind of, it may be a right-wing version or a kind of left-wing Thomas Carlyle version, like where we've become a soft society. What do you attribute that to? Is there, or is this a way of people now wielding that sense of outrage and that sense of harm are in a position to do something about it? And so they're using that because they'll use whatever they can to get what they want.
You'll see this sometimes in the Twitter debates and sometimes in pieces where people say, well, finally, marginalized voices are getting a chance to talk, and this is what they're saying, and this is the reason for this. I don't quite buy that. I mean, just to kind of follow one thread back to, I think was it the 70s? The book Words That Wound was a kind of critical race theory text that made the case that we should treat words more like bullets, if not quite exactly like them. At least they are things that can do harm. And you have in 1991, Henry Louis Gates writing in the New Republic, this great piece, I think it's called Let Them Talk. And he's just kind of dismantling piece by piece the critical race theory case against relatively broad free speech norms and saying, look, this was central to the civil rights revolution. It's not going to be the last time that marginalized people need strong free speech protections. If you undermine these things, you're going to destroy one of the best tools that you have, all things that I very much believe. And it is as if now you still have an elite that is very pro free speech and marginalized masses in various places who are anti-free speech. In fact, it's quite the opposite. As we just discussed, these were kids on a $5,000 a year trip to Peru who attend Ivy League colleges and fancy prep schools who are doing this. And so it just doesn't square, I don't think, with the facts to suggest that it's finally a kind of marginalized cohort for whom these norms don't work, who are rising up because they finally have the tools to do so.
And do you think it forestalls the, to go back to something you were saying, does it forestall the possibility of actually coming to a common language, in a workplace situation where if somebody is being a jackass, and is constantly saying things that people find offensive or gets in the way of work, of being able to say, hey, would you stop that? Or why are you talking like that?
Right.
Because now,
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, I talk a lot about in defense of people who I think are wrongly fired. And certainly when it comes to the First Amendment, I'm basically as far as you can go without literally wanting, I'm going to murder you now being legal.
Right.
But, if I were running a workplace, I certainly would have a rule that you can't be terrible assholes to one another.
Right.
And the test for that wouldn't be, did you use a racial slur or not? Although if you used a racial slur, instead of to discuss whether we should include it in an article, you used it to hurl at someone. Well,
Right.
yes, then you've
Yeah.
run afoul of it. But you've also run afoul of it if you just say, awful things that have no
Yeah.
place in civil society. And so I think that there's a misimpression sometimes that even in the realm of kind of informal sanction or censor, people on my side of the argument are interested in defending literally any horrible thing that
Mhm.
anyone ever says. No, I think it's very reasonable for people to lose their jobs for being a terrible jerk to their coworkers, for
Right.
example. I just think that first, you should have pretty clear and consistent rules for what it is. Not that you can know every case ahead of
Mhm.
time, but people should at least have a general sense of what the rules are. And right now, we're at a point, I would argue, where lots of people have no idea what the rules are. They're applied wildly, disproportionately. You even see people digging up things that people did 5 years ago when the rules
Right.
were different and applying them now. And you don't have to read very deeply into a philosophy of law textbook to
Mhm.
figure out that all of these things run against what we generally think is fair.
Yeah, and I mean, even it goes back 30 years, right? Where there's a case of a Boeing executive who had written a story when he was in the military in the 80s, arguing against women being in combat situations, a position that was overwhelmingly the majority view at the time he was writing, both within and without the military. Who since got rid of that position, as did the military itself, and he got called on the carpet for that. That seems strange, to say the least. But then you also recently tweeted about a case of a police officer related to Valentine's Day, where you're like, hey, you know what? Yeah, this guy should get fired for this. Could you talk a little bit about that and what, how that kind of, gives some sense to what good
Yeah.
limits on workplace speech might be?
Yeah. So this was, I forget if it was a meme or what it was, circulating in a police department that basically said, what was it? George Floyd, you take my breath away. Something,
Yeah,
something terribly offensive about George Floyd dying,
right.
and a kind of pun that related to Valentine's Day. I forget
Right.
exactly what it was.
And I think it was that it was a picture of George Floyd and saying, "You take my breath away. Happy
Okay, yeah.
Valentine's Day." And of course, he expired after saying, "I can't breathe."
So this is a case where, first, just analytically, is this an attempt to adjudicate a truth proposition? Is it an attempt to engage in civic discourse where if we chill this kind of speech, we're going to be less able to arrive at the truth in any way? No, it's certainly not that. Second, does it relate at all to the job of the person we would ostensibly fire? And if you're a police department, your ability to do your job as a police officer is inextricably tied to the trust you have in the community. Obviously, we have terrible mistrust between the African American community and police departments because of decades of bad behavior on the part of police, and this would correctly be seen as yet another instance of this attitude toward Black people who've been brutalized, that it's something to make light of and not take seriously, something that would directly interfere with a police officer's ability to do their job. So to me, this is an easy case. And you see, I don't often agree with the LAPD police officers union, and it kind of shows how much of an easy case it is that even they said, if we find out who did this, we have no place for this in our ranks. I think that along these same lines, you saw during the impeachment trial, Donald Trump, his lawyers saying that this was an attempt at like constitutional cancellation, and you see Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley complain about being victims of cancel culture. And I think it's good to underscore that there's definitely one category of people who ought to be praised and punished for their political speech, and that is politicians. That is what we do to politicians. This is what we must do to politicians. It is baked into the job. And this goes to something that Will Wilkinson has talked about since being fired from the Scannon Center over a tweet, and then he has started a Substack where he argues that there's no such thing as cancel culture. And he wants to argue that by using the term with a pejorative connotation, it allows bad actors like what I just described of Trump's lawyers and Ted Cruz to kind of bask in the negative connotations without doing the actual work of adjudicating each individual case on the merits. I think that, Will is right that there are those kinds of bad actors. I also think that if we step back and look at what people are calling cancel culture, there is a reason to go further than what Will wants to do and adjudicate each case on the merits. There is a case for stepping back and saying, just as we would if we were in appeals court and the courts below us kept sending us cases where people seemed to be innocent and the evidence didn't, always big up. And also there were mobs standing around when the judge was handing down his sentence who were yelling more, more, more. We might step back and take a holistic look and say, there's some cultural problems here that we might want to address. And that's kind of what I see myself as doing.
Do you talk a bit about how this intersects specifically with journalism and media people? Traditionally, certainly for the past 50 years or more, journalists have been the ones waving the bloody shirt of the First Amendment more than any other sector of society. They're like this, we need free speech in order to have a free press. You have 150 people at the New York Times saying the letter that was leaked to the press, it's not that they're saying this guy needs to be fired for the word that he uttered on a trip with students in Peru in 2019, but we really need to look hard at this. This is causing us a lot of distress. How bad is it that the journalistic class seems to be not going along with cancel culture, but in very many ways leading the charge on that?
Yeah, I think it's very bad because, there are certain professions where free speech is especially important to the value added. And two that I focus on, academia and journalism, are both, I would argue, especially important to the truth-seeking project. And to talk specifically about journalism, if you imagine a traditional newspaper and a meeting at the beginning of the day where everyone is hashing out what stories are we going to cover, who are we going to assign, what and where, all sorts of things that are very emotionally upsetting might come up, right? It might be that ISIS released a video and you have to sit around the table and watch the most horrific things you can imagine, violating all the most sacred and righteous taboos that we have as humans. And you have to watch it. And then you have to discuss it dispassionately because you have to figure out whether you're going to put it on the front page, whether you're going to show it to your audience or not. Journalism just isn't a profession where you can have a hypersensitivity to things like this. Whereas, if there was someone who was a call center employee and their manager called them into their office and was like, you have to watch this ISIS video, we might say, okay, well, that doesn't seem right. Why would we subject someone to this horrific thing at work? We have to be able in journalism to talk about controversial things. And if we can't, then we can't fulfill that function of helping our whole society to talk about controversial things. And so it's a big concern, I think.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned you also write a lot about academia. And one of the pieces that you did last fall, I guess, in The Atlantic had to do with Princeton University having this kind of strange case where a variety of people, including the president of Princeton University, said, you know what, this is a fucking goddamn racist institution. It is just filled, even now with racism and with, kind of white supremacist leanings, et cetera. And then the Department of Justice, this was a Trump move, or Department of Education, doing a kind of brilliant troll saying, you know what, we've heard you say that you're like a super racist institution. We need to have an investigation to find out whether or not you should qualify for federal money, because if you're that racist, you shouldn't be receiving federal dollars. What comes out of that? What is going on at Princeton, where a university, and in one of your columns about this, you pointed out that, Princeton is highly sought after by Blacks and also does a lot to attract as many qualified minority students as they can, and faculty and things like that. What's going on with this?
In another piece about Princeton, actually, there was this long faculty letter signed by, hundreds of people making a long list of demands. I mean, dozens.
Yeah.
And among them was a faculty panel to investigate and sanction any instances of racism. So basically a kind of standing version of the kind of thing that Ibram X. Kendi has suggested for the United States, but at Princeton. And you didn't have to, there was no definition of what constituted racism, but the document itself seemed to constitute it very, very broadly.
Mhm.
And you could see how it just was obviously at odds with academic freedom, so much so that even now I was shocked that so many professors signed on to it. And I started emailing and talked to probably, I don't remember exactly how many, I think I said in the piece, but a bunch of people, and found a bunch that said, yeah, we don't agree with that at all, but it's a group letter. You know how these things go. We sign on to these things, and we don't mean all of them, but we think it's the right spirit. And I think that there is an overwhelming desire to make Princeton a more just place, right? And it doesn't shock me at all that the culture there would be uncomfortable for people, not because anyone is standing there like, Bull Connor or something,
Mhm.
but because they're taking people from all over the country from lots of different subcultures. You have class issues, you have who is more likely to be a first generation college student. And it's just hard to be I think it's harder to be a racial minority in lots of settings and lots of places. And anyone who's ever traveled to, a white person who's traveled to Tokyo and walked around the airport, you could feel like, oh, I'm the only one that looks like me around here. I wonder if other people are thinking that too. Something as simple as that. You don't actually need racists to have the experience of being one of a few in a cohort where everyone else is different on any metric. If you made three people walk around with an orange scarf tied to their arm, you'd probably, they would probably feel and perhaps even be treated differently in some ways, right? That said, it seems as though the most extreme demand that anyone is willing to add to a group document in situations like these is suddenly signed on to lots of people, even when it transgresses against the core values of what someone is doing, as if it being from the right place somehow minimizes the damage it would do to everyone at the institution. And it seems as if it's just as simple as the kind of groupthink that you see in lots of settings where, lots of people decide that there's a satanic panic that is going on in the Pacific Northwest, and we better do all sorts of things after 9/11, when we all decided that, everyone needs to take their shoes off every time they go to the airport.
Oh, very few of us decided that. We all go along with it, but
Right, exactly.
yeah. In that group letter, one of the things, and you alluded to it, was that it called for the creation of a panel of faculty who would actually validate people's research, faculty members. We're not even talking about students here, and whatever courses they have to take or if they're allowed to speak freely in the cafeteria or whatever, but, actual tenured faculty, people who are either tenured or on tenure track, were going to have to submit their research to this group to make sure that it did not further white supremacy or, that it wasn't considered racist. That's clearly at odds, as you said, with academic freedom. It's with intellectual freedom. It's with a search for truth. Do you think that kind of mentality comes out of an idea that we don't need to find out anything new, that we're no longer, I mean, you're saying that liberal science is an attempt to learn more about the world and or something semi-objective about the world or something different about the world. Is the presumption behind some of this stuff just that, well, we're not going to find out anything new. There's no such thing as progress, really. So all we are going to be doing is managing how people interact.
Maybe. There's a strain of it that I think does feel like that to me. There's a strain of it that wants to make the argument that the kind of knowledge we should be seeking is a kind of experiential or emotional knowledge that a white supremacy embedded with the Enlightenment has cast out for too long. And so we need these different ways of knowing that have been repressed. I think that John McWhorter is onto something when he talks about there being a religious aspect to some of this. And I think, the ideology of critical race theory that's been hanging around the academy before interacted with this rising generation of people who were acculturated in a different way. And I think that the difference, Haidt and Lukianoff have written about safetyism and coddling, and I'm, basically on board with their argument. I also think when I report on college campuses, I recognize how much social media has changed the texture of life, that you have people who aren't afraid to say something in class because, they're going to get made fun of in the moment, but because they're terrified that they're going to be walking across campus 10 minutes later and someone is going to have posted about them in a way that like hundreds of people see. And in all sorts of ways, social media just changes our relationship to speech and the way we encounter it. And if you're someone who has always known that, if you're someone who has always dealt with like, you know, 24/7 bullying instead of bullying just when you're at school, if you've always seen the power of texts and memes and even kind of experienced the public square as something that wasn't mediated by gatekeepers at all, but was instead just all of your peers and then all of people in your age cohort everywhere, it must do something different to how you think about speech, especially if you're not being acculturated into the values of the things that you and I care about in any kind of deliberate way. And I think something about this mix of this kind of old ideology and this new experience with technology has combined to give us at least part of what we have.
At the same time, I suspect you would agree, social media, however we want to define it, in general, I mean, the kind of media and technological innovations and revolutions of, say, the past 30 years or so since the World Wide Web kind of made the internet accessible to everybody, became a mass medium, generally are good things, right? Because they do allow more people to talk in more places about more things.
Yeah. I mean, there's a little part of me that always thinks, oh man, Gutenberg and then centuries of religious war.
Yeah.
But, I think Gutenberg was a good thing too. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't have wanted to live through those particular centuries right after to get to like the really good parts of just books everywhere. But yeah, I think that on the whole, it's a good thing. And, this is something I was thinking about when after the storming of the Capitol, you had kind of crackdowns on right-leaning social media sites like Parler, which I was critical of. I don't think that it was right to kick Parler off the internet at that moment. And as sympathetic as I am to that, I also think that some of the right-wingers who were complaining about that were doing so in such overheated terms when, in fact, they have much more ability to get their ideas out even after Parler was banned than anyone did like 30 years ago, right? And I think that, a critique I often hear is, oh, you act like this is new. And there have always been restrictions on speech. Like, no, I don't act like it's new. I totally agree. I think that there's always been a Puritan streak in American life. I think there's always been a McCarthyite streak in American life. From a bunch of different directions, free speech has always been attacked and perennially requires us to stand up on behalf of both the First Amendment rights and the, preserving the tools of liberal science. And this is just, the battle in our day, and there will be another after us, and there were many before.
Part of the argument about Parler, and this gets thrown in the face of conservatives, in particular right-wingers, where they'll say, I'm being canceled because a private company is kicking me off of their private platform, Twitter or YouTube, whatever, or Amazon Web Services, which hosts a site like Parler, says, you know what, we don't want to do business with you because we think you suck. And conservatives, if we're talking about gay couples coming for wedding cakes to a baker, the conservative will say, oh, well, you know what, like just go find, bake your own cake or go find another baker. And then when this happens, but would you agree that and I mean, I think this is where you're kind of going, is that, kind of legally and maybe philosophically, there's always people always have the right to, mostly the right to refuse opening their house, maybe not their business, but their house to unwanted guests, so like I open up my Twitter door and you come and shit all over the carpet, I tell you to leave. No, that's not a problem. But would you agree that we lose something when we become so brittle that every time somebody disagrees with us, we call the police and have them escorted out of the house and then try and do everything to make sure they can't talk to anybody else we know?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it is a very tricky tension. And I think, Ken White, who blogs as Pope Hat, will sometimes disagree with other people who are generally in agreement with him about free speech by saying,
he will always do it in the meanest and funniest and most incisive, I say this as somebody who has, been on the receiving end of this, ways possible.
Yeah. And he'll say, look, Free association rights are important too. We need to protect them. And, I think that he's right. I think that one line that I come down on this is, to me, there's a difference between you've offended me and I'm going to demand that you leave my house, and there are 40 people outside yelling through the windows that I must demand that you leave my house, and I'm going to comply with those people. And to me, the latter case is a pretty easy way to focus one's attempts to change the culture. And I think if we change that, then we won't have the problem of so many people being asked to leave their houses that we can't talk to one another anymore.
You recently were tweeting about a variety of journalists or journalistic outlets kind of being aghast that Clubhouse, the audio only social media platform where people can talk, and there's no record. You're not, according to the terms of service, you're not supposed to record anything. So you have these conversations that are unregulated, unmoderated, except by the people who stage them, and then they disappear. And a variety of journalists, including, Vice Magazine and whatnot, was, outraged that this kind of behavior was going on. Why does it bother you that, Vice or other journalists are saying, we got to do something about this? There's, something bad could be happening here.
The logic that I'm seeing, I really do believe that this is going to end up with demands for the equivalent of content moderators in physical spaces. I really do think that within my lifetime, I will see this bar as irresponsible because people are just conversing with one another. I really do see it going in that direction. It sounds crazy. I think that people, again, are trying to apply this idea of harm to the mere fact that someone said something that transgresses against something you think should be taboo. And you are so emotionally harmed by that it's unacceptable, right? And I have been on Clubhouse a fair amount to try and kind of figure out what it's all about. And you have people from all over the world dropping in. And I'm often up late in California. And so I get people in lots of different time zones. And part of what is wonderful about it is we might be talking on that platform about, America's coronavirus response, and then someone from Senegal drops in, and then someone from Jamaica drops in, and someone from Germany drops in.
Pretty amazing, really.
It is. It is. It's remarkable. It's wonderful. There's such value to it. And you don't have to think about that very long before you see that these people all have wildly different local social contexts. And so if you are too strict in the social norms that you enforce, these conversations simply can't happen, right? And the examples that some of the journalists who are giving are citing, it is not, again, I hate you, you terrible person, because you are Jewish and I want you to die. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about, in one example that was going around online, someone used quote unquote the R word, right? Because they were talking about the whole GameStop surge in stocks and this community that, what do they call themselves exactly? Like
from the Reddit, the Wall Street.
They called themselves like something retards or something like that. And someone was, again, using it to say, what does this community call themselves? Let's figure it out. Why do they call themselves that? Trying to understand, right? And the idea was, I guess, that this social media platform that has, hundreds or thousands, I don't even know, of rooms going on at all times is supposed to have a person sitting in each one to flag that. To what end? For what purpose? I don't see what value that adds. And I guess just kind of one more thing along the lines of Clubhouse, it does bring up interesting questions. We were talking before about freedom of association and whether platforms should be able to ban people, kick people off. And I generally think, yes, that they should. I have been thinking about this one tricky area where, like, what if it's the case that Twitter or Clubhouse is the one place that the local county public health person is announcing where you get the COVID doses, right? Or the one place where, you can even see it during the Trump administration. He wasn't allowed to block people simply because it was considered a kind of civic need to have people know what the president is saying and to follow him. And so are there any civic uses that would get so enmeshed with civic life, with the need for self-government, with the need for a citizen to get like urgent information, where we would decide that you need to have some kind of access. And I can imagine that possibility, but I don't know.
You recently were talking about and this was in reference to a CNN article that was telling millennials you are on the cusp, you're 41, so you may or may not be a millennial, depending on how we talk about this stuff. But CNN was saying, like, sorry, millennials, emojis are no longer cool. Which, it's obviously it's a slow news year so far, I guess, that we're being treated to stories like this. But you said, there's this sense among a lot of media that it has to play to a kind of fabricated consensus of 22-year-olds about
Yeah.
what is cool and what is socially just. You are against that. What is going on, do you think, that it seems like, places like the New York Times, places like CNN, in its own way, Fox, continues to be going for some kind of modal, viewer that doesn't exist anymore. But why are these large, major institutions caving so quickly on, what they think is right, what they think is cool, what they think is what their audience or some subset of their audience wants to, see and validate?
Yeah, I don't know. That article you're pointing out, the CNN one, it immediately reminded me of all the times recently where I see on Twitter the phrase "read the room."
Yeah.
And I hate this phrase. I'm like, no, don't read the room. Tell me what you really think after critically examining the thing, and bring your singularity as a person to it, because that's what I want. A bunch of people having different takes, not everyone having the
Right.
same take. What's the use in that? And yeah, I mean, the generational thing is kind of just a funny offshoot of this. But yeah, God, I think that TikTok is a wonderful platform because it, again, is just an expansion of the number of voices, and it allows people to be creative in 1,000 different ways. And as far as I can tell, it shows you a generation of people who are, yeah, different than other generations, but great in many ways. And I like interacting with them. And I it would depress me if the overall consequence of those interactions was for everyone who's like in their 30s and 40s to be like, oh, what kind of music do I have to like because the 22-year-olds like it? I'm like, no, we should be, you know, friendly, and also having, lighthearted debates about whether the music from whether Sublime is better than like whatever their analog to Sublime is, or I don't know. And it just, there's so much talk about the importance of diversity now. It's in every university mission statement, every corporate training thing. And yet there seems to be less and less support for actual diversity and actual inclusion, right? Where you have lots of different kinds of people and you're trying to take the best from all of them. And that is, if it were just the words diversity and inclusion, I absolutely believe in both of those things
Yeah.
and the wonderful value in them. And in fact, many of my critiques in this area are transgressions against those values that, that are just trying to create a monoculture, and weirdly doing it at the moment when it is less possible than ever before.
Right. Well,
Like
maybe
in a way
that's
that's
why, right? Because oh God, I'm going to misstate this, but in the same way that American popular culture only came to lionize American Indians when they were no longer a threat, when they didn't really exist in large numbers on where white people lived. It's kind of like we talk a great deal about or we're trying to create a monoculture at the moment when it is no longer even possible to do so, much less advisable.
And as someone who values these journalistic institutions, even the ones that I disagree with, I have a lot of trepidation about it, because if the New York Times, I think the Washington Post actually isn't as bad along these metrics, but if the New York Times can only talk to like 10% of the country or 15% of the country, it ceases to be any kind of a common square for civic discourse. We lose another one of those. It also, like, even though I am often, maybe usually at odds with the politics of the New York Times. I want big, powerful counterweights to government. And the press has traditionally been one of those. And I want someone who can publish the Pentagon Papers, who can stand up to lawsuits, who has a kind of institutional heft that it takes to go toe to toe with a federal agency. It isn't just any upstart website that can do this. You would be crazy to do certain stories if you just had a Substack behind you, because you would get sued and destroyed. And so I think that people on the right who would love to see the Times go away completely, if they ever got their way, they might regret that it was gone.
In your Twitter bio, you identify as an omni-American. Can you just explain where that phrase comes from and what it means to you and how it kind of fits into the conversation we've been having?
Yeah, it comes from this wonderful book, The Omni-Americans by Albert Murray. And I got turned on to this by Thomas Chatterton Williams, who wrote a great piece in The Nation called, what is it, The Blues, Murray's Blues, I think it
Hmm.
is. And it's the idea basically that these color categories are made up constructs. There's no such thing as white Americans and black Americans in the way that most people understand it, that white American culture or Anglo culture or WASP culture and African American culture are bundled up in a thousand different crazy ways that you couldn't possibly disentangle if you tried. And that these skin color categories are, you know, deadening our understanding of things and our ability to relate to one another, and that we ought to jettison them. Thomas makes a great case in A Portrait of Black and White, his
Hmm.
book, about the need to jettison them. And Camille Foster too talks about race abolition all the time. And I think I'm not quite as radical as they are. I'm not unlike Camille. I wouldn't challenge someone who called me white and say, no, I don't identify as that all the time. But I do think that we should be moving in this direction. We should be taking steps, and it's funny, there are whole swaths of the left. I remember, you would think that Ta-Nehisi Coates would be on the opposite side of the culture war from this kind of thing. And yet go back through his writing and you'll see he uses the phrase people who believe themselves to be white all the time. There's this whole kind of left-leaning idea of whiteness as a construct and a pernicious construct. And I wish that the people who, I think the way that they've defined it, it is a pernicious construct. I don't understand why they think mandating seminars in every corporation and college in America, where people are taught to think of themselves as white and interrogate their whiteness and their white privilege
Hmm.
and look at everything through that lens, why they think that is going to help jettison these categories. I don't think a self-abnegating notion of what it is to be white is ever going to take hold among the masses.
It also seems particularly strange, when we're talking about paradoxes, that at a time when people can be more individualized, or so many other aspects of our lives are becoming more individualized. We have a broader menu of sexual orientations to choose from. We dress differently. Everything is personalized in our service, in our commercial life, in our education in many ways, that we seem to be going back and saying, no, we want fewer racial categories that include more people and are more invidious than ever.
Yeah,
wh-
and it's not to say that we shouldn't think about the racial categories that have been handed down to us, or we should, I have no objection to white privilege per se and thinking about it. It's just the degree of emphasis. And I wrote a profile of Chloe Valdery, who you may have talked to, I think, before, and she has a kind of different take on what diversity inclusion would actually constitute, that I think is a much better take. It's striking that there are so few people with different takes. You would think that there would be 1,000 different models all across the political spectrum of this. But in fact, it's not that. There's just like a kind of monoculture and then a few outliers. And I wonder why that is.
Yeah, talk a bit about Valdery's her her approach to education, essentially, and to kind of cultural and individual enrichment. How does that work, and why is that, to your mind, a compelling alternative to literal and figurative groupthink?
Yeah, I mean, one reason it's compelling is because at the very center of her practice, she promises, I'm not going to essentialize anyone. I'm going to approach everyone as an individual. I'm not going to segregate groups by race. I'm not going to presume that because you're white or because you're black, That must mean you have a particular experience or orientation toward all of this or position on all of this. And that alone gets much farther than a lot of the Robin DiAngelo white fragility approach, for example. Valdry also has this notion of trying to figure out what enchants people and using that to figure out how she might get people to love one another. And the idea of getting people to love one another is obviously a very tall order. And when she first said, I was going to figure out how to get people to love one another, I thought, oh man, what am I going to think about your answer? But then she kind of spelled out this very compelling idea that some things do enchant us and we can learn from those things because they have roots in kind of deep cultural stories. And she uses pop culture to try and draw out these stories and to get people to kind of better appreciate and accept themselves, and through that to accept others. You know, I always want to see the evidence that these things work if we're going to have a bunch of people doing them. And so I'm not totally convinced that Chloe's approach works. I am convinced it does not do the damage that other approaches do. I don't know what the benefit is. I will say that I would enjoy sitting through it because we would be talking about whether this passage from Baldwin and this Jay-Z lyric mean the same things or different things about what it means to be human and what that can teach us about how to relate to one another. That seems a lot better than a bunch of people sitting in a room thinking, oh man, this is bullshit and no one wants me to engage actually the material. I'm just supposed to nod my head and agree. And it could cost me my job if I say anything, which I think for many people in corporations and universities, that's what they say to me that they feel when they go through these things. And so yeah, I'm a kind of let a thousand flowers bloom in every aspect of life. And Chloe seems to me to be doing something that is different and worth looking at.
Do you feel you've been writing at The Atlantic now since, what, about 2010, 2011? Do you feel like that is a house with many rooms in it, or is that becoming narrowed in terms of kind of political approaches or ideological approaches to these types of questions?
Yeah, I think that it is a house with many different rooms. I mean, we have, John McWhorter and Ibram Kendi, who have been kind of furiously arguing with one another online lately, who are both writing for us regularly. We've got, David Frum and I, who disagree on lots of kind of the libertarian versus national security conservative or kind of neoconservative axis. We have got, people in lots of different places on the left with lots of different orientations. We did not have, to my knowledge, any Trump supporters on staff, which, I can't claim to offer any diversity there because I wasn't a Trump supporter. I think it's a thing that lots of journalistic organizations have been trying to think about. And, we've definitely had open Trump supporters writing for us as, on a freelance basis and even making arguments that were kind of Trumpy. I think we had Adrian Vermeule writing, I forget what it was that I absolutely disagreed with, but I was glad that we had him writing whatever it was that I can't remember. Yeah. And, I think, I would encourage people who think that they couldn't write for The Atlantic if they're a writer out there who's maybe right-leaning or conservative to don't assume that. We might publish a broader range of things than you think. And, if you have a pitch, email me and I'll at least get you to the right editor who considers such things. And it's a challenge, though, because the pool of labor in journalism is just totally skewed, right? There just aren't a ton of people who are on the right. And some of the people who are on the right have very good opportunities. The best people on the right have very good opportunities at right-leaning outlets that are sometimes much better opportunities than we can offer. And there are a ton of people who I would love to have writing at The Atlantic, but, Charles Cook, who I think is great, is busy doing his thing at National Review. And, there are tons of people at Reason who are doing their thing at Reason that I would love to have anytime. And I think that, the commissioning editors feel the same way about many of these people because I'm asked from time to time, who should we have writing for us? And sometimes I give answers of people who are very ideologically diverse, and it's that they can't because of their job, not because they can't because we don't want them.
Is that talk, is it part of what's going on here is that we have lost that larger sense of community, if we ever had one, of what it means to be, say, an American in 21st century, in the 21st century world?
I think so, and it was one reason why there were a lot of different criticisms and arguments about the 1619 project, and I think that my criticism of it was that we ought to separate the ideas of the Declaration from the men who wrote and ratified it. And if we just take the ideas that we're all created equal and that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are something that we're all owed, actually almost everyone can agree with that. It's pretty striking, right? The Trotskyites can agree with it. The National Review people can agree with it. The AOC Democrats can agree with it. And if you have something like that, if you have a civic creed that is in your literal founding document that everyone can agree with, why would you want to say, no, the actual founding is this other time that maps closely onto the worst thing in American history? You know, if it's true that we can choose what our founding is and not just say the literal founding when the documents were signed, even if we can choose, why would we choose 1619 instead of 1776 uh, if we think it's important to have some shared notion of something, right? Because a shared something is very difficult, and you see it in countries without a shared civic creed, where it starts coming down to blood and soil and ethnicity and goes wrong in a bunch of certain ways. And because of this genius founding document, right? Because of the Declaration, we can get around that. And the 1619 project seems to me like, well, we could get around it, but no, actually, we're going to put ourselves in the same difficult situation as less fortunate countries are. Um, I think Danielle Allen writes wonderfully about this. I think she's at Yale, and I've written about her a couple times with the Atlantic, and her book on the Declaration and a commencement address she gave actually at Pomona College some years after I graduated about the Declaration of Independence. I really think that it is a unifying thing in American life, and that Lincoln saw that very clearly,
Yeah.
actually.
I mean,
And
he's the one who, in
a
a way, made it the founding
yeah,
document, right? In the Gettysburg Address.
yeah. And so to me, if you have something like that Danielle Allen and the people at the Claremont Institute
Hmm.
and the people at Reason and the Trotskyites all agree on, it tells you something, and you ought to exploit
Right.
that in some way.
Do you feel, and this is something personally, I like to believe that the libertarian moment, which is a phrase that my colleague and I, Matt Welch, came up with in, I guess, 2008, when it's already there. We're already living, vastly more innovative and interesting and individual lives than our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents could even imagine. But we're about to acknowledge that it's real and it exists and makes it even bigger and better, is always, just about to happen. But do you, what are the ways that we spread a kind of libertarian ethos in the best way possible, so that people are more comfortable with kind of living their lives as they see fit, learning from other people, engaging other people, and kind of living peacefully, rather than kind of always moving towards an authoritarianism of saying, no, it's this way or you're out of here?
I think that I think that there are many people who kind of quietly identify as libertarians in one way or another. And then I think that there are a lot of people who, when they think of the word libertarian, what they think of is a "don't tread on me" flag and a absolutely minimalist view of government, to the point of eliminationist entirely, and also the view that any kind of social welfare spending is verboten, any kind of social safety net is verboten. I don't think that reflects the views of most people who describe themselves as libertarian. It certainly doesn't reflect the actual policy options available to libertarians in a world where we're going to live with people who profoundly disagree with us, whatever kind of libertarian you are. And I do think that there's an opportunity to focus a lot more on this wide range of ideas that are really appealing and compelling. I've talked already about this pandemic moment and the kind of, I'm sure you can go back and point to like 30 different Cato and Reason web pages that talk about the FDA and
Yeah.
um,
And the
and the
CDC.
cost of this sort of thing and the
Yeah.
CDC.
Right.
Um, I think also, you see the right is in tumult in a way that really could be an opening for the libertarian faction to kind of assert itself at the same time as the kind of like Trumpy faction asserts itself. I don't know how that would work out in the end. It'll be really interesting to see. I also think that I hope, depending on how these different disease variants go and the pace of vaccination and everything else, we're approaching a moment where there's going to be a big appetite for liberty, for like an ethos of appreciating the ability to travel the world, to gather in large numbers. There are some things that we can point to, like, all of the libertarians who are saying for so long, why do you have these restrictions on telemedicine? This is ridiculous. Why can't you carry a cocktail out of a restaurant if you want to take it home and they want to bottle it up for you? This is ridiculous. All these kinds of small freedoms where we've seen that actually life is just better if you give them to people and there's no appreciable downside. And I think it's just a matter of trying to reach out more to people who disagree, engaging in these conversations, and doing so in a way that is at the level of all of these varied feelings and ways of life and cultural leanings, instead of always going to the first principles argument for why you should change your entire way of thinking and adopt my entire way of thinking.
And why, if the government is going to subsidize one thing, it should be fully automatic weapons for school children or something like that.
Right.
Private, who only go to private schools, of course. And
right, if they can pay the toll.
That's right. And of course, no age of consent laws, all of the, all the way down the litany to some kind of paradise of a zero state. Are you optimistic about about the next 6 months, about the next 6 years? How does that, how are you feeling about things these days, including kind of where journalism and media seem to be going?
Yeah. Good question. I am heartened I'm heartened by Substack starting up. Not because I think that it is necessarily the best endpoint. I kind of personally preferred the kind of wide open web of people blogging on their own sites and everyone able to access it, for example. But I'm glad in the sense that someone I've read a long time, like Matt Iglesias, I saw the small ways that his writing was just less interesting than it could have been because he was in this social milieu that was kind of quietly censorious in various ways. And, there's this straw man that people who talk like I do actually just want people to be allowed to like say racial slurs or something, right? And of course, this isn't the case, not only because I explicitly don't want people to say racial slurs, but also because Iglesias is a great case of there's so much more energy in his writing. There's so much more interestingness. There's so many more provocative points well made since he's gone to Substack versus when he was writing at Vox. And I think that there are a lot of people.
So he started out as a blogger, then ended up working at the American Prospect, a kind of left of center magazine, worked in a couple of different places, co-created Vox, and then left Vox because it was too stultifying for him.
Yeah. And
somebody like Glenn Greenwald follows a similar path, right? Where they are, and they're interesting because they're far left for the most part. So that it's not like they're libertarian necessarily, but they create institutions and then kind of either get kicked out or have to leave because it's too much of a straitjacket.
Yeah. So I'm glad to see people building institutions, building different things. I think that you need escape clauses from places that become too stultifying. I'm also optimistic, I suppose, with respect to the pandemic, although my optimism is a worse world than I would have imagined that I would describe as optimism 3 months in or something, which is to say, I long ago moved from expecting that there would be a rise and decline in cases and it would go away, or that even there would be a vaccine and it would go away, to thinking actually probably we're going to have a vaccine that makes it so that most people don't die of this or even get hospitalized of this, but that it's going to be endemic for a long time in different parts of the world. It could involve having to get booster shots every year or two. It could be like another flu, ultimately, that is always going around. And my fear is that something about that is going to cause a world of more travel restrictions and just like less general freedom. And it's not to say that the world with this thing has to look exactly like the world before in order to be defensible, but I think it has the potential to go too far. And America during the pandemic is kind of the worst of both worlds in a way, where it's like so much of the country doesn't even believe it exists or isn't paying attention to any kind of prudential behavior changes, that it spreads like wildfire. But then we also have these like draconian lockdowns in ways that go too far and don't do any good. So, I do think that we're going to be at a better moment than we are now, and that freedom-loving people are going to have to put their foot down at some point when enough vaccinations happen and say, okay, public health schools, we have to have some sane assessment of risk. We can't live our lives in lockdown forever, fearing this thing. We just have to move on in a prudent way, but nevertheless in a way that properly values freedom and liberty.
Do you have any hopes for politics in in a kind of narrow partisan way? Do you think something will happen where in the near future, we'll be getting better options than a party headed by Donald Trump and a party headed by Joe Biden?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I don't mind the Democratic Party headed by Joe Biden in the sense that I like a guy who's not very charismatic. Joe Biden he doesn't have the charisma of an Obama or a Trump. No one is filling the streets to yell and scream for him like he's some kind of like political version of a rock star. People relate to him actually in a way that comes closer to what someone like Gene Healy, who worries about the cult of the executive, wants. Not that we've moved nearly far enough in that direction, but I kind of like a president that like no one is totally satisfied with, even in their own party, and that feels like he has to come up with actual policy wins in order to bring people along instead of being able to rely on a cult-like following. Um, as far as where the parties go ideologically, I have no idea after this. The Republican Party is just a mess all over the country. I look at it aghast here in California, where I could point to a laundry list of easy fixes that would make the state a lot more livable. And yet there's just no opposition party. It seems like they don't even want to contest elections in a way where they could possibly win. And I hope that changes. I don't know if it will. I do think that Republicans more than Democrats tend to be kind of let's all get on one page and value loyalty more. And so it's like whoever, like, what is the ideology of the Claremont Institute going to be? I'll tell you after the next Republican nominee is named, right? Like, and because so much of the conservative movement is going to like rally around whoever it is, the next GOP nominee, it could come down to like having a good debate or a better ground game or better political consultants or something like that could be the thing that decides the next iteration of the Republican Party.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Conor Friedersdorf of The Atlantic, thanks for talking to Reason.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.